We're just going to start right at 5 after. All right, it's 5 after, so we're going to start, and others may come in. I'll try to monitor that, and we'll proceed. So, hey, welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this program on the 11th of February on updating the latest doings of the FirstEnergy Corporation and in general, the HB6 bribery scandal, which has been considered by many, if not most, as the single largest political and bribery scandal in our state's history. Greg Coleridge here. I'm Move to Mend co-director and connected with on the Move to Mend Ohio Network Coordinating Committee. Carla Rautenberg is also a member of that committee, as is Deb Hogshead, who's with us as well, as is one of our featured speaker, Catherine Terser, which we'll get to momentarily. I'm sure many of you have been trying to keep up, or maybe not, with this scandal that's been going on, and particularly over the last few weeks, given the trial of one Larry Householder, who, as I'm sure everyone knows, former Speaker of the House, indicted and standing trial now for taking a massive amount of bribes, upwards of over $60 million from FirstEnergy Corporation for his assistance in helping pass legislation and to get others to help him pass legislation to bail out FirstEnergy. And that trial is slated to continue over the next few weeks. This program is an update about where things stand to hold those responsible. Yes, this trial is about holding Householder, and there have been other efforts to hold responsible individuals, but is that enough? Should not the entity itself, which is admitted, the entity itself, FirstEnergy Corporation, to bribe Householder? So on the front line in Ohio, in educating, advocating, and organizing for good government is Catherine Terser, and I'm delighted to welcome her to share her reflections on the current developments of the scandal. I'm not sure, Catherine, when I first met you, but well, I don't want to give away dates or expose ages and all, but it's been a couple decades. And
yeah, I was going to say, I feel like it was 1998.
Is that right?
Possible?
Wow.
Yeah.
That has been a spell, but over that time, you have been consistent in educating, advocating, and organizing for good government, or whatever else you want to call it: self-determination, self-governance, right to decide, political justice, democracy, on many fronts, whether it's money in politics, gerrymandering, and so many others. And so, and that's been through citizen action, common cause over the last, I don't know how many years, but quite a number. And then currently
a decade.
Okay. Yeah. With the coordinating committee of Move to Mend. So Catherine's going to provide comments for about 15 minutes. I'll do the same, hopefully less. And we'll open it up for comments, questions, and discussion. Please mute yourself now. There'll be an opportunity to, if you want, to chime in with questions, or you can put them in the chat, either way or both. So if you want to be recognized when we get to that point, I'm sure you know where the chat function is at the bottom. You just click on that and put in your question or comment, or if you want to be recognized when that's the time, then we can, go down to the very bottom screen, hit reactions, and there's an opportunity to raise your hand, or just wave if you're on screen. So with that, Catherine, welcome.
All right, everybody. So I'm going to admit Madeline, and oh, that's not right. Sorry, everybody. So I always think that when you try to work your way through the Householder trial, it's actually fairly complicated. So basically, I've structured this so that, first of all, we'll talk a little bit about Citizens United and how it features in this scandal, and how Householder and Borges are using this as a way, Borges as a way to explain that, like, it's politics as usual. It's not actually illegal. And then I'm going to go through what we learned. Primarily we had an FBI agent, Blaine Wessel, who spent, days, 9 days on the witness stand laying out the case. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information, kind of how things worked, and, a little bit about its text, about their secrecy, and all those different things. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of FirstEnergy, the cost of corruption, and then a little bit about how Governor DeWine is connected to all of this. And so with that, so you all are very familiar with Citizens United, which essentially said that corporations can, in fact, spend money in elections on political advertising. Now, this essentially treats corporations as people. It essentially treats, money as speech, and it actually created a situation where corporations, including nonprofit corporations, can actually spend money on elections, on political advertising. So this isn't money that's given directly to candidates, but is money that's spent on elections. And because we actually never took the steps to actually create transparency so that we could actually follow the money, we are left with a situation in which it is actually constitutional, and it's clearly a public good to be able to follow the money. But, when you think, hey, we want to amend the US Constitution, that seems really enormous. But you would think a very kind of simple, hey, let's create greater transparency. Citizens United was in 2010. And we have not made the appropriate changes at the federal level. And some of you will be really familiar with like the Disclose Act that, looked like it might almost pass last year. And you'll be familiar maybe with Husted's early efforts in 2010 to do some better disclosure of ballot committee advertising, money that went to them, and also some dark money disclosure just following Citizens United that basically didn't go anywhere. So we have not done the things that would be necessary so that we can stop the kind of corruption that this trial is all about. And okay, so I'm going to start with arrests. Now, you don't actually need to know all the characters. I think what's important to know is Larry Householder was the Speaker of the House, and he coordinated what they call the Householder Enterprise, but essentially was the mastermind behind all of the different money that was hidden from public scrutiny through the use of these dark money C4, but it's like a title that the IRS gives to a type of nonprofit that's able to be more active in politics. And he was the mastermind behind all of this. And this is what the prosecution is now in the process of attempting to prove, that what he was doing was essentially not like the bribery that we're often familiar with, like, we think, nudge, nudge, here's a bag of cash. And what I'd really like is for you to pass this bill. We're not talking about that kind of bribery. What we're talking about is money given to Householder so he can basically establish power so that he could become the Speaker of the House, so that he could actually pay for some of his bills. There's some personal benefit there as well. But essentially, the money from FirstEnergy given to these dark money groups was a way to kind of cement his power. And so we're talking about a different kind of bribery. Bribing someone so they can get power is very different than, hey, here's $500,000. The guy going off and buying his honey something and then passing legislation. It's a little bit different and it's a little bit complicated. But what's important is there's the getting power, and there was also personal benefit that has been addressed during this early testimony with FBI agent Blaine Wetzel. Now, Larry was arrested with some of his allies. One was Neil Clark. So Neil Clark is somebody who he described himself as Larry Householder's hired gun. He wrote a book, What Do I Know? I'm Just a Lobbyist, that was published posthumously. He did die as a result of suicide. Basically, after his arrest, he killed himself. And so he is not standing on trial. But one of the things that we're hearing, one of the things that jurors are hearing are segments of, conversations that were taped. They're texts or messages that Neil Clark left, sometimes emails. So that all becomes part of the picture of this trial. So then there's Matt Borges. Now, Matt Borges, some of us remember the Dieter scandal of, the early aughts, where, the treasurer, a guy named Joe Dieters, essentially, was very interested in becoming governor. So he's a treasurer. There were other people that were interested in being governor. And so one of the things that he was doing is that he was working with his friends to try to beef up his kind of prospects by building his war chest. Now, Joe Dieters was never arrested. He was never charged, but Matt Borges was, for essentially extortion, essentially for working with a guy named Joe Grudaria, and basically having folks who wanted to invest Ohio's money, who wanted to basically be a financial advisor, do the investments for the money, that giving those contracts to the donors was part of it. And Joe Grudaria, if you remember, anyway, he ran off FBI. It was a huge thing in the early aughts. And slowly, Matt basically pled guilty to slightly lesser charges. He slowly built his way back, and he actually became the chair of the Republican Party for a period of time. So he slowly, as a kind of a political operative, built his way back. Following his tenure as the chair of the Republican Party, he, basically worked as kind of a lobbyist consultant kind of guy, political operative kind of guy. And he was arrested because of his role in the referendum. And, if you all remember, the referendum was particularly nasty. And it was a real big push from the pro House Bill 6 people to stop the people from gathering signatures to stop the bailout bill. So then you have Jeff Longstreth. Jeff Longstreth was the person who was the chief political ally to Larry Householder. He has pled guilty, essentially, to operating a dark money pack and participating in racketeering. Juan Cespedes is another political operative who also has at this point pled guilty. We have not heard from either Longstreth or Cespedes, but Cespedes is expected to be the next person to testify. So on Monday, we may hear more directly, because right now we're learning about, this case, from texts and messages and sometimes pictures of things. But this will be an opportunity to hear from somebody who is right in the mix. Now, one of the things I just talked about kind of the humans that got arrested and a little bit about who pled guilty. One of the things that is interesting is Generation Now, and I included this political advertisement because, all over the state, we were receiving these advertisements, or we were seeing on television that Generation Now was, putting this information out, this most innocuous name ever, Generation Now, but putting out kind of House Bill 6 is good, it's clean energy, all of these kinds of things. And I think what's really important here is that the corporation is treated much the same way as a person. The corporation in this case actually pleaded guilty. And with that, I'm going to scare us all. Okay, so this is like when the arrests occurred, Dave DeVillers, who was the U.S. attorney, went through this very complicated flow of money. And I think it's worth looking at this just for a really short period of time. The one thing I would say about all this is this scheme was incredibly complicated because they wanted to avoid public scrutiny. And so none of us need to know all of this. This is just, it's to help you kind of think in your head about how one dark money group gave to another dark money group. It's also important to realize that when this information first became available, FirstEnergy was company A. And so like when Householder was arrested, we all knew this was about FirstEnergy, right? And yet the company itself was not identified. All right, so we get to January 23rd of this year, and we go into this case against, the two folks that are still standing. So there's Borges and Householder. They're still saying, hey, we are innocent. And so we're at the point where, we've had 10 days of trial. There have been some breaks because of COVID, in case you're trying to figure out, well, why is that? There have been some breaks because of COVID. And I think the thing that's super important as we're looking at all this is that we're beginning to understand kind of the level of secrecy and how they were using their power and to basically encourage their friends and enemies to keep their mouths shut. And they were doing things like, so many of us will remember the referendum. And the reason that I included this flyer here, that was part of this scandal. This is from Ohioans for Energy Security. So once again, one of those dark money 501c4 groups that, in fact, they were incredibly xenophobic. Like when, suggesting that if you sign something, the Chinese government is actually going to get your information, just is incredibly problematic. And it just highlights how if you don't have the kind of transparency, you have some real problems. So one of the things that I also think is that, the trial has some kind of amusing little things. Like, for example, one of the things we learned, it really had to do with how there was a real love of the word boom, and also how kind of the hubris. And so the reason I included this is an image that was texted back and forth between the characters in here. And so these folks, we're talking about Ty Pine with FirstEnergy. And then and then we have Mike Dowling, who was a VP of External Affairs at FirstEnergy. Then you have Sam Randazzo from the Public Utilities Commission. And finally, what's interesting here is you have Matt Evans. Now, Matt Evans is probably a name you're not familiar with. He is with Company C in the original indictment. He's with the Boych Company. And so, one of the things that as we're going through all this process is that we're learning, first of all, is about the $60 million from FirstEnergy, but also money from others and money going to others that you would not expect. So one of the things that we discovered is that AFL-CIO received $1.4 million essentially from C4, where the money originated from FirstEnergy. All right, so I did want to highlight, this is the portion where I wanted to highlight about FirstEnergy. Now, first, I found it just so aggravating in July of 2020 when the arrests occurred, and the arrests didn't include FirstEnergy executives, or it didn't include FirstEnergy on the complaint. But the things that have happened with FirstEnergy since then that are important to know, because when you think about corporations, they were fined $230 million in a deferred prosecution agreement. In other words, what happened is they essentially agreed that they were guilty. They said that they bribed public officials, and they agreed to some transparency, and they agreed to pay $230 million, which is a drop in the bucket. The way David DeVillers, former U.S. attorney, described it was that it was a way they wanted to find that they would feel and yet wouldn't shut them down, which is interesting, right? Okay, so it wouldn't shut them down. And then I think what's important is, we've been talking about kind of this householder scandal at the State House, but meanwhile, essentially, FirstEnergy had bribed, and this becomes complicated, of course. At the moment, the briber, FirstEnergy, has pleaded guilty, essentially saying they were a briber of Sam Randazzo, who was the former chair of the Public Utilities Commission. So this is Sam Randazzo. Now, what is interesting about this is that he received $4.3 million. Oh, sorry, I need to back up. I say that. There we go. He received $4.3 million from FirstEnergy, but basically what happened is FirstEnergy gave money to Sustainability Funding Alliance, which then gave the money to Sam Randazzo. And this was essentially the company that Sam Randazzo set up to hide these kind of activities. Now, Sam Randazzo's house was raided by the FBI a long time ago, right? November 2020. He has yet to actually, as far as we can tell, be arrested, etc. It could be that behind the scenes, Sam Randazzo is actually cooperating. I think that's a likely thing. But as we think about the Householder trial, it's about the corruption kind of the early election, the elections to get Harry Householder in and his allies in and get him elected speaker and to pass House Bill 6, the bailout bill, and to push back on the referendum. This is separate. But when we think about the kind of money that went into actually setting it up so that they would get this nuclear bailout of these two plants on Lake Erie is kind of astonishing. Now, I figured you might be interested in kind of like the scandal by the numbers. So what we know is, that FirstEnergy spent $60 million. Others spent additional dollars. I think it's important to think about kind of the amounts that were paid and what they expected to receive. 60 million sounds like insane amount of money until you realize they were hoping to get 1.5 billion from electricity ratepayers over 7 years. And then the other thing that's interesting, okay, so once you start kind of, hey, we're going to move this bill to be good to the nuclear plants, what happened is that there was a push to bail out aging coal plants. I mean, if you're bailing out aging nuclear plants, we should be bailing out the coal plants as well. Now, part of House Bill 6 has been repealed, but not all of it, including the subsidies for those two plants. And one of the plants is in Indiana, one of the plants is in Ohio. So they're not even all in Ohio. Now, when this says 80,000, this varies depending on what's going on with electricity rates. And you all know some of that utility stuff is complicated. This is an average since the passage of House Bill 6, since it actually went into effect, of 80,000. I got that from the Ohio Consumer Council. And 0 bills passed to actually create a more transparent system. Now, I said kind of at the beginning that I would get into a little bit about how FirstEnergy connected to Governor DeWine. Now, Governor DeWine actually appointed Sam Randazzo to the Public Utilities Commission. And one of the things that I'm going to make sure that you all have all of these charts. So like, if you're like looking at this and trying to think, I want to follow this, but it seems like a lot. Yes, it is a lot. I don't want you to worry. I'll share my slides so that you can look at the charts. I think what's really important is that over the years, people have just started using these dark money groups. And in December of 2020, what happened is that it came out that, in fact, Governor DeWine was asking FirstEnergy to support his daughter Alice's campaign. And then all you have to do is look and say, okay, FirstEnergy gave to the inaugural campaign. Well, that's just to, like when you think about who gives big to inaugural campaigns, these are to butter up the governor, to butter up the incoming administration. Then you look at the Governors Association. Well, what happens with money given to the Governors Association is that money ends up going to the candidates that are running for office. Now we have Partners for Progress. That was another nonprofit that was established, a C4 that was established, that ended up giving money to another C4 to support Mike DeWine. And I think it's important to think about, well, how does this all connect, and what else don't we know that isn't part of the trial but's worth thinking about? Now, the other thing that is interesting is I mentioned Partners for Progress. The guy who started Partners for Progress was a FirstEnergy lobbyist. Well, he stopped working for FirstEnergy when he actually joined Governor DeWine's administration as the Director of Legislative Affairs. And one of the things that was interesting is kind of the texts that were revealed during the trial, showing how they were trying to figure out how not to have McCarthy's name on the IRS filings. And in fact, you know, how can I put this? One of the things that's so interesting are all these texts about, like, how do we not break the law, but really get into the gray area? Don't tell anybody I asked you this. So, you know, there must be a creative way to handle this. And so if you think about kind of how the governor surrounded himself, it then leads us to think about, well, all of the transparency that's necessary. Now, many of you may have been paying attention to thinking about kind of, you know, Attorney General Yost's name came up. We know from testimony on Monday that Matt Borges was selected because of his close relationship to AG Yost. AG Yost said in the text that if he would be going after House Bill 6 if it weren't for FirstEnergy support and because of Borges, and because of you, is the way the text read. Then you have Secretary of State LaRose, and Secretary of State LaRose actually asked to meet the president of FirstEnergy Solutions, the subsidiary of FirstEnergy, which is now Energy Harbor, during the time that the ballot board was involved in the referendum. So there are all of these side pieces that are not exactly part of the trial, but we're learning through the trial about how this worked so that FirstEnergy was actually able, you know, essentially to buy legislation. So this piece is, you know, really focuses on, like, well, what can we do? And I've done it again. What can we do so that we can think about reforming things and all the different kinds of transparency? You know, we want to prevent conflicts, the Public Utilities Commission. We want to be able to follow the money in elections. We want, like, one of the things that happened in the late 90s is there was a guy named Roy Ray who was a senator from Akron, and he had a consulting gig with what was Ohio Edison section of FirstEnergy. They all came together as FirstEnergy. He essentially got a bill from them, and that formed the basis of some legislation to do another kind of bailout. You know, they called it deregulation at the time. And one of the things that was interesting about that is when it was discovered by reporters because of conversations with the Legislative Service Commission, the legislature closed the records to the Legislative Service Commissions. So rather than addressing, hey, recusal standards, hey, maybe you shouldn't have a gig with folks that actually have a real specific thing that they want from the State House, or a variety of kind of ethics reforms. Instead, what they did is they closed the records to the Legislative Service Commission. And these are the lawyers, these are the folks that write the bills, do the research for the legislators. And, you know, if we try to say, okay, here are the problems, what can we do? Well, we could create greater transparency so that we could understand what's going on throughout the legislative process. I did want to highlight, we have a couple different kind of resources that are available, where you can follow the trial. So I would encourage you all to sign up. That's a bit.ly. So if you put that in, it will then expand to a longer kind of URL. And you can get kind of regular updates. The updates are from Sandy Tice, who was the former State House Bureau Chief of the Plain Dealer. She's been hanging out in Cincinnati and doing some research for us. She doesn't go every day, but most days. I also think it's worth checking out kind of our history of corruption. We have a long history of corruption, and y'all remember CoinGate and ECOT and all of the different elaborate schemes to rip us off. And, you know, unless we actually make some significant changes, it'll just keep happening. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing screen. Let's see if I can do that. No. Sorry, it's going to take me a minute to figure this out. There we go. And my guess is you might actually have some questions.
Well, why don't we reserve those till the end? So you can formulate those questions now, put them in the chat, or write them down if you would care to ask them live in person. So appreciate very much, very complete and astounding. Hard to keep track of all the people and actions, activities, and mischief that's been going on, and the legalized bribery and illegal bribery that's been going on. And sometimes they go hand in hand, and it's hard to differentiate one from the other, but it's all bribery in a sense. And just before giving a couple comments, I saved these pieces, the mailers during that era of where some of your FirstEnergy money that went to Householder and Company was used to try to defeat the citizen referendum to stop, to repeal HB6, and this was one of them. Look at that scandalous looking guy knocking on the door, declined to sign the petition. And then, of course, the one that ties into the Chinese, racism and and the like, and warning, don't give your personal information to the Chinese government. You can see that. It's just, these are keepers for how horrific and just unbelievably undemocratic, and people hired to actually intimidate petition signers. So with that, all right, I just have a couple comments I wanted to go or items to go over and comment on, and then to actually invite you to take some specific action. So as was mentioned, FirstEnergy has not been up to this point, as Catherine said, been held financially and politically and morally accountable and legally accountable in any sort of fundamental way, unlike the efforts against the company officials, board members, unlike efforts against those they tried to bribe and did bribe, Householder, Borges, lobbyists, and others, but not the company itself, at least not fundamentally. And when we speak and I speak about fundamentally, I'm talking about in proportion or equivalent to what I believe, and I think many people believe, is the scale of the threat to our environment, because of course they tried to prevent renewable energy from taking place, and threat to whatever you want to call the system of ours, whatever amount of democracy we've ever had, a big threat to it. And they've been about the business of undergirding self-governance, self-determination, legitimate representation through elected officials for many, many decades. This is obviously the most egregious, but there is not, particularly with what has happened over the last couple of years around this scandal, the effort to hold that company accountable in scale, in proportion, is not anywhere near. Yes, as Catherine mentioned, this deferred prosecution agreement, okay, $230 million does sound like a lot of money to you and I, but just in context, in the third quarter, fourth quarter numbers of earnings of FirstEnergy doesn't come out until Monday, but as of the third quarter of 2020, FirstEnergy Holdings was $334 million. So they were fined for this, horrific, federally, for this horrific scandal less, about 2/3 of what they have earned in one quarter of 2022. And I think the fourth quarter, at least early on, their earnings is supposed to be even greater. At the state level, so at the federal level, this deferred prosecution agreement, by paying the 230, potentially that gets them off the hook in being involved and in having to undergo any other federal action. So that's federally. But that does not discount the possibility of there being state action. And so, as Catherine mentioned, there has been a suit filed by the AG, Yost. It's not a criminal action, but a civil one against individuals in FirstEnergy. And it's all connected together, all those actors, both human and corporate, under this what's called Ohio Corrupt Practices Act. And it includes in that suit a language to dissolve the company, but there is an easy sort of opt-out. And I'm going to share my screen right now because I want to make sure everybody understands what that is about. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see this and that it is readable. So in holding the company, okay, apart from and separate from the individuals involved, to whatever extent they are going to be held accountable through these trials and fines and everything else, that's separate from how we need to be seeing, holding through the lens of full accountability, of corporate accountability, FirstEnergy. So the absolute minimum, Yost needs to refile this suit because right now there's this suit that's been filed against individuals and the company, okay, separate from the company. And that's because in the complaint, so in the suit, there's this nice little spiffy provision in the suit that says, what Yost is calling for is that pursuant to the Ohio Code, each defendant business entity and nonprofit entity named in this complaint be dissolved. Okay, good start, right? That the company, whether it's the for-profit or nonprofit entity involved, should be dissolved. But then there's that little word after it, two-letter word that's looks pretty innocuous, but is unbelievably important. Or it's not, or rather than, it's or. So it can be one or the other, that the company or all these companies be dissolved or reorganized such that no agent, officer, or representative found to have engaged in acts in furtherance of retains a position within the defendant business or nonprofit entity. Meaning, all you have to do is sort of just clean house, get rid of a couple hacks, CEOs, board members, replace them with some others, and guess what? You're good to go. So that's what this suit originally filed by Yost calls for. So at the front end, we're tough. We're trying to dissolve the company. But that's one option. The other is we can just replace a couple of people with some others. So what has been suggested and what Move to Mend Ohio and others are suggesting is that he refile the suit and separate the individuals from the company. Because if you do that and even keep this language, you can keep that language, but it becomes moot, right? If there's no individuals that are part of the suit, then you can't have the or is irrelevant. We would want him to obviously to refile the suit just against the company and then take out everything after or, but it becomes irrelevant if it's just against the company and you have the or in. So anyway, we're not hoping, we're not expecting, we're not holding our breaths. So at a very minimum, and I mean very, very minimum, we're asking Yost to refile the suit. More appropriate though, much more appropriate, again, in scale and in proportion to the fundamental threat to whatever amount of democracy we've ever had in Ohio, is to revoke the company charter under what's called quo warranto or ultra vires. Those are Latin terms that have been used by the king sovereign in England, which was transferred over to the states, which were ways to sort of control, to define, and to remove, and to put in its place corporate entities. Quo warranto is, by what authority do you have to do what you're doing? And so there is provisions in the Ohio state code that calls for the way to revoke a corporate charter. And ultra vires is, you've acted, company A, company B, FirstEnergy Corporation, beyond the terms of your charter, which in FirstEnergy case is to follow the law. And they obviously have not. So under this notion, you can revoke the corporate charter. And it's been done many times. Here's some language, a couple of instances. and I can send this off to you, but there's just some really wonderful language done previously by these radicals on the Ohio Supreme. I mean, just imagine, give some thought to, could we conceive today of the Ohio Supreme Court saying something like, the corporation has received vitality from the state and continues during its existence to be the creature of the state, must live in subservient of its laws and have such powers and franchises as those laws have bestowed upon it and none others. As the state was not bound to create it in the first place, it is not bound to maintain it after having done so if it violates the laws or public policy of the state or misuses its franchises or oppresses the citizens thereof. And the second one is one of my favorite. The time has not yet arrived when the created is greater than the creator. And it still remains the duty of the courts to perform their office in the enforcement of the laws, no matter how ingenious the pretext for their violation may be, nor the power of the violators in the commercial world. So corporate charter revocation, to revoke a charter, was considered to be pretty normal, pretty much of a default. So much so that even a century ago, more than a century ago, an attorney general, somebody in the position of David Yost, a Republican, by the way, named David K. Watson, went after, at that time, the biggest, baddest, most powerful corporate entity of its day, Standard Oil Corporation. And that's the language that was filed by Watson to revoke the charter of Standard Oil for them trying to form a trust. They already had a monopoly, and monopoly, but you're trying to form a trust, which is super duper monopoly. Sorry, that ain't in your charter. I'm going to try to revoke it. And eventually, they took off for New Jersey, which was sort of the charter mongering state. So anyway, that's sort of the language. That's the background. Calling for the revocation of FirstEnergy is certainly something that has been done previously in dozens of instances throughout Ohio history. So what's going on right now in terms of taking action? There's education that's been going on for many months, people trying to get letters, op-eds. We've been trying to lobby Yost and calling for this separation between, refiling the civil suit under the Ohio Corrupt Practices Act, just refile it and go after solely and exclusively FirstEnergy. And the other is to pursue independent legal action. I'm not going to name the state organization, but we've been in touch with a state environmental organization that is thinking about, doing, if Yost doesn't do what we want him to do, this environmental organization may do that. And then we're, going to be reaching out to state representatives to have them consider filing and calling for the charter revocation of FirstEnergy. All right, so what can you do? I'm going to end it here, and that is education. We need to get the word out, whether we win, whether we lose, in terms of holding FirstEnergy fundamentally accountable. What a tremendous educational opportunity. And so I put together this talking points on holding FirstEnergy Corporation accountable for their misdeeds. And I'm putting that in the chat, a link to this document, if I can I'll do it after I stop this. And basically, here's the points. FirstEnergy admitted, so it's admitted to being a guilty party in this historic bribery scheme. It's not enough for FirstEnergy executives and those receiving bribes to be accountable, to be held accountable. The company as a separate entity needs to be held accountable. Goes on and talks about this point of the deferred prosecution agreement doesn't prevent the state from taking separate action. A corporation is a legal entity, publicly chartered and licensed in most cases at the state level, and certainly in the case of FirstEnergy, they are chartered in the state of Ohio, which means we have the power and the authority and the right to hold them accountable and responsible by, if we think, and they have, broken the law, to revoke their charter. Corporate charters in Ohio originally defined very specific conditions that had to be followed. They're very similar if you think about them. There's hundreds of individual professions. If you are a professional and fall into a couple of hundred, I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of like 600 professions in Ohio. If you are those kinds of individuals, lawyer, doctor, all kinds of, engineers, you have to receive a license to practice, to do business. And those licenses are a way for the state to establish sort of standards that we feel is necessary to ensure safety, welfare, protection, protect consumers, protect the environment, protect workers, protect, you fill in the blank. That's what licenses are. A corporate charter is the equivalent of a license to a corporate entity as a license is to an individual professional. And so corporate charters were originally issued one at a time by the state legislature. When a corporation acted beyond their authority as defined in its charter, it was revoked. Again, similar to a professional whose license is revoked for inappropriate, immoral, or illegal acts. Talks about David Watson going after Standard Oil. Current Yoast has filed civil suit. It mentions that. FirstEnergy charter should be revoked for the corporate's admission of its direct involvement, and revoking FirstEnergy's corporate charter is less. And I think this is an important kind of metaphor. It's less about punishing the company and more about protecting the public, the environment, and democracy. And this may be a stretch, but the way I think about it is, if you and I as an individual, our individual body has a cancer in it, when we try to get attention to remove that cancer, how many of us think of the cancer as, oh, we're getting rid of the cancer because we're punishing the cancer? That's a living thing, right? All these cells that have metastasized. No, we don't think about getting rid of the cancer as punishing the cancer. We think about getting rid of the cancer as protecting the body politic, or the body. And that's the equivalent here. We're trying to get rid of and dissolve FirstEnergy, not because we're trying to punish the company, but instead as trying to protect and affirm the body politic, including whatever amount of democracy we've ever had. So anyway, that's all I've got on that. And I invite you at this point, as you want to ask your question and the like, this is meant, and I'm putting just momentarily this link in the chat for you to use. And so I'm inviting you to formulate any or some of these as a letter to the editor, social media posting, talk show call-in. And if so, I just put together, use this to submit something to the Cleveland Plain Dealer just yesterday. So I would like, if you are interested and are ready at this point to commit to actually writing a letter or social media, but in particular writing a letter, to put that in the chat, your name and what publication, whether it's the main paper, online paper, or a lot of communities have suburban papers, to submit something to them just to make sure that no more than one person is submitting something to their medium, the like. I invite you to do that. So with that, I'm going to end this, stop sharing. And so if you're interested in and committed to actually doing something like that, in submitting a letter to the editor, at some point, put your name in the chat with where you plan to do that. Okay, so Catherine, I don't know if you've been looking at chat, but I know early on, Eric mentioned, is the slide, I don't know which one you were referring to, Eric, is this available on the web already? And I think you mentioned it, you can supply the slides. And again, this recording is going to be sent out to everybody.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Greg. Really appreciate all the info. And sorry, my camera is not working today. It's an old computer, and that's what I popped on this morning, so I apologize about that. But my question is, or my comment is, I was trying to get some friends here today through Facebook, and I just think the algorithms, I have 3,500 friends, and no one even liked the thing. So I know, even my partner, so I know that it didn't go anywhere. But that said, so what would really help, and I apologize for missing the very beginning of this. I was on a work call, but what would really help is, and I don't know, Greg, if you want to, maybe add it to the top of the talking points, or just, it would really help me to have a sentence or two that clearly says the reason that they did all this. Like, the reason is they wanted to keep, nuclear energy versus the renewables, or, just obviously more elegant and more eloquent than that, but just some way that I can really emphasize, here's the why. Like, this whole bribery scandal happened. I think a lot of people have heard about it, but they don't really understand what they were trying to get around, and
Mhm.
so anyway, that's just my invitation, and thank you so much for all of, I mean, if someone would come to this, it would be great. So I definitely am going to pass this out in email and in LinkedIn. I'm thinking maybe I'll get more hits there. So I really appreciate you both and everyone that worked on this.
Well, that is a very good suggestion. So if, I mean, even though I put that link in the chat, hold off in formula or using it to formulate anything. I will update it with some point that gives the reason why, to bail out these antiquated fossil fuel, and nuclear plants that have no business still being online, that they were losing money for. So this is all about their profits. So good suggestion. Other comments, questions, either in the chat or raise hand by either waving or hitting reaction with that.
Well, Greg, there
Go
was
ahead, Jen.
something I wanted to add. I attended the Columbus Metropolitan Club. It was a forum on dark money just recently. I'm going to pop it into the chat. What was interesting about this was that Ashley Brown, who was on the PUCO, and we're talking about the 80s, is now the Harvard Electricity Policy Group. He's a Harvard guy at this point on kind of utility stuff. He was suggesting something very similar to as opposed to going after the Attorney General. He was suggesting we go after the Public Utilities Commission. Now, I think you actually are going to get more traction in some ways with going after the Attorney General, but the PUCO has let us down repeatedly, and basically saying, hey, PUCO, why is it that these are regulated companies, why are you not regulating them? You know more and more and more about how they basically wanted to abuse, consumers of their product. They should be, the PUCO itself should be held accountable.
Good point. Yeah, that was a interesting program. So again, it is a regulatory agency, and regulatory agencies were designed as a way to, it was one of the 3 or 4 forms of escaping democratic control over corporations. Rather than legislatures using charters to fundamentally define, corporate entities didn't like all the democratic muscle flexing. So, number one, they ran from states with strong rules and charters to weak ones like New Jersey, until Delaware out New Jersey, which is why more than half the Fortune 500 companies are now chartered there. And then the state, that's one way. Second is that they ran from the local or state level to the federal level, where laws could be much weaker, like antitrust laws. John Sherman, who was an Ohio senator, there was a very strong Ohio antitrust law. Then they went to the federal level, and what we know of today is the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 is a horrifically watered down version of what was on the state level that sort of preempted it. Third way they sought to escape democratic control was to create regulatory agencies, because regulatory agencies was a way that, it kept the pressure off of the companies and off the legislatures to be accountable. And so you'd beat up these regulatory agencies, and these, agency people were appointed by governors. And even if you lose and they actually, go after companies, you can always go to court. And plus they regulate harms. They don't abolish harms. And then lastly, the fourth way was to escape democratic control from going from the state legislatures that define charters to the courts, in particular the Supreme Court, thus the creation of corporate constitutional rights. That's the ultimate sort of shield away and outside from democratic control. All right, Deb.
Yeah, I just want to mention that it's been very disappointing here in the Dayton area to see where the Dayton Daily News is placing coverage of the trial. It's in the inside of Section B, and I'm not even hearing on our local news television stations much talk about the trial. So I just wanted to say it's just very disappointing that the coverage isn't more upfront in our area. Thank you. Pass.
Well, Deb, that sounds like an absolutely perfect hook to use for a letter to the editor. Hey, you guys have not been giving legitimate coverage to what is a very important issue that actually doesn't even go as far as it could or should, because it's only addressing, and it is not placing in context the need to hold not just these individuals accountable, but the company itself. So there's your hook. Terrence. Hey, Terry.
Hi. So if the charter was revoked, how would that play out? How would it likely play out, and how would you like to see it play out as far as what happens to the company, what happens to the shareholders, what happens to the power plants, et cetera?
Well, it could be, taken a lot of times in the past when companies have been dissolved, they've been, taken over by some other individuals. So it becomes a new sort of company, a new charter. Now people who are, who takes a bath oftentimes are those who are the investors, right? Because now their stocks are not worth much, if anything. Well, that's how it goes. You decided, you made a conscious decision to invest, or even after the investment was made and the corruption was exposed, you still maintained your investment, hoping that it would rebound. So who really loses oftentimes are the shareholders. But if the company itself is sort of, if new people come, if it's a new company and new people come in to run it, they could hire the same people, or if they completely are dissolved and its assets, distributed elsewhere, a lot of, that power is going to have to be supplied, right, by some other company. So what other company does that will obviously have to figure out how to expand. They may figure out how to expand their energy, which will need obviously more employees to do that. So, that would be a way to sort of make up. Now, is it going to be a perfect seamless transition? Absolutely not.
So would the customers have lose their power, or their actual electricity, or how could the customers be protected?
Well, with the ability of energy being transferred over the grid, what now is supplied by company X in a certain area would be supplied by company Y in the adjoining area, or it could come from halfway around the country, wherever. The ability to supply energy is a lot easier when you have a grid that can be used to supply that energy.
So if the charter is revoked, are the officers of the corporation then exposed to criminal liability for the stuff that we're talking about?
Well, I think there's some, they are under criminal. There is a federal suit, right, Catherine, still against those individuals.
Yeah, there is. And one of the things that Ashley Brown talked about was, so the threat of essentially dissolving can be used to restructure the board. It can be used to establish much greater parameters. It can be that the end goal is to make sure that we have electricities and consumers are not abused, and to make sure that the folks that participated in essentially ripping us off or wanting to rip us off, that they are actually held accountable and taken out of power. And so I think there are lots of different ways to think about this, beyond, hey, it's all going to be taken away. Well, what are the things where the humans that made really bad choices are removed and different ones are put in place? Does that make sense?
Yeah, though it is important to keep in mind that we are not just talking about the humans. Because
I understand. I was just thinking about it kind of.
Right. But the humans are acting on behalf of, they are doing the implementation of the entity.
Greg, a
But the entity
metaphor I
couldn't
like
do
to
anything
use.
without the humans.
Well, it's
Yeah,
true.
they are the hands of the corporation. The
Correct. Yeah.
officers are the way it acts.
Good point. The attorney amongst us. Other comments?
I think that it seems to me, and maybe this is naive, I think it's really important to see people from the corporation in prison. I mean, if that's where rubber meets the road there. I mean, nothing will deter future misbehavior like long prison sentences for these people. I don't know, is that realistic or?
Sure it is. It's possible. Absolutely. But if the entity itself still has the gravitas and remains in place, it just opens, ceilings become floors if they can continue to get away with things. And there needs to be some recognition and some accountability of these entities that have legally and illegally broken the law in some way that transcends, the equivalent of getting a parking meter fine, a little more than that. But in many cases throughout history and up to the present time, and, Ralph Nader's done a great job at demonstrating how even when companies are found guilty and pay enormous sums through any kind of entity, through any kind of, regulatory apparatus, they're oftentimes able to write it off or write off a portion of what they do as sort of a cost of doing business. And it just can't stand. That just simply cannot stand. Yes, we need to think about the impact to doing what we're talking about through the eyes of consumers and through the eyes of investors. But we also need to look at this, maybe fundamentally, even most importantly, through the eyes of citizens. Because if we are not in charge of the entities we create, then we are doomed. And that has impact on every single issue we care about. Because the bottom line on trying to get where we want to go on every single political, economic, environmental justice we care about is having the ability to decide, having the right to decide, having democracy, real democracy. If we don't have that, forget it. We're not going to get anywhere fundamentally. So what can we do? So we should always look at solutions as what are the solutions that not only hold the individuals who are responsible for the malfeasance responsible, but that's going to change the relationship of power that currently exists. If FirstEnergy, after this, still has the amount of power, okay, they've lost a few 100 million people. They've had to, change Chuck Jones for Mary Jones or Mary Smith. So the hell what? It's about power. It's about democracy. It's about the ability to decide. And that's what's got to change. And that's what the charter is. And that's what abolishing corporate constitutional rights is all about. It's about changing the relationship between people and the artificial creations that we've created so that the Frankenstein monster doesn't take care of us.
Greg, it's Madeline. I don't know how to put my hand. I have a question for Catherine. Thank you. Your explanation was so helpful today. How do you see the trial I heard very little about it on the television. I try to follow online, but how do you feel the way the trial is going so far from your perspective? Thank you.
I've been a little bit worried, and part of it has to do with because of the breaks, because of COVID a couple times, and because the FBI agent was on for days and days and days. I've gotten there's a part of me that's like, okay, so all of this is completely fascinating, but we're able to step away. There's a part of me that's like, Sandy Tice called me yesterday, so she's in Cincinnati, and she's like, so I've spent a whole day, listening to essentially the defense attorney basically try to pick it apart as politics as usual. And it doesn't land. It's kind of, it doesn't land except for, she's like, there's a point where you're just like, I'm worried they just want it over. And sometimes if you just want something over, you're not necessarily going to make great choices. And at this point, it's likely to still be, 6 weeks. So Deborah was asking about, like, is the trial broadcast? So this is one of the things that is super interesting. Federal court is not broadcast. Okay, so yes, we can actually watch this, which is, here we are having this whole like dark money secret stuff, and you're like, and the public can't actually watch the trial. I mean, I just said, hey, the jurors might be getting worn down by how long this has taken. Oh, 8 of them got stuck in an elevator yesterday too, so there was that. Like it's just the stuff that, like, yes, like, yes, that's what I worry about. But it does sound like the FBI agent was really laying it down based on documents and listening to recordings. And one of the things that was super clear is how often they told people to keep their mouths shut, like in sometimes in not great ways. Like, well, your house up was one of them. like some of them, if you say anything, or and they're like, hey, it was a joke, but like, what is clear is how much secrecy they wanted. They had to understand that what they were doing was not just disrespectful or, kind of gross politics, but wrong, criminal.
All right, last call. We'll get this video out. I will update these talking points. It'll be the same link, so I mean, you can, there's no harm in connecting to it now. It'll just be updated. I'll try to do that by the end of the weekend. So
Just
if not,
to
if
get
there's
this on the
any-
record.
Pardon me?
Great presentation, Greg. Great presentation, Catherine. Very.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you all. Appreciate it. Get the word out, spread it to whatever extent you feel you can that fits your time and mediums, whatever that may be, beyond yourself. Because the greatest strength that the corporate crowd has had in expanding their power and rights has been a combination of intimidation, obfuscation, making things so complex that most people can't understand, and of course, secrecy, and the ability to sort of do things sort of one at a time. They've gained corporate constitutional rights, if you will, like a salami, one slice at a time, until Citizens United, where they just got greedy. And I think this is an example where they just got so greedy. But that happens sometimes. You just think you can get away with anything. And so this then is an opportunity, just as Citizens United was an opportunity to sort of flip the script, and now it's out in the open, and we need to talk about corporate constitutional rights. Well, this is an opportunity, the scandal, to talk about, legalized versus illegal bribery, and, to what extent is the company itself going to be held accountable, and how we as citizens today and those we elect are looking at our artificial creations similarly or differently than how our forebears looked at them. And they looked at them very differently, where back then they understood that they were in charge, they were the superiors, and the legal creations they created were subordinate, not with rights, but with privileges, period. Today, public officials, they not only look at corporations sort of as equal, but you should have the power. I mean, most regulatory agencies now have turned over the public regulations to self-regulation. You companies can regulate yourselves. So that whole relationship has just been completely flipped on its head. It is beyond sort of ignorant. It is democratically lethal. And so it's up to us to sort of understand that and do what we can to help people get on the other side of the learning curve about what we're doing today, and what's going on today is not inevitable or irreversible. It was not how it once was, and it was not how it was meant to be. All right, everyone. Thanks so much. Be well.
Thank you both.
Bye.
Appreciate you both.
Thank you all.